that there will be plenty of time for questions after the lecture this afternoon, and I have to say that Marge reworked her presentation, I think, 10 times.
It's true.
Anticipating what we all may want to know. So
great.
I hope it's covered. So
great. And before we get started, is it possible to turn the heat down or off altogether? Both because the blowing noise is a little hard to hear. Oh, that's it. So maybe just turn that off, because it'll be hard to hear over the blower. Yeah. And I think it's the cans, whatever it is, that's making that noise.
It's the fire.
Yeah. Oh, I bet it's the sterno that's making that noise. Yeah.
Set up the alarm.
Actually, that helps already, turning those off, yeah. Just got very warm in here. Sterno is an amazing source of heat when it gets right down to it. That helps, yeah. And maybe even open that other door, if you can. I just don't want to have to resuscitate anyone halfway through, especially myself. Katsiolioni, Nirobani Nabasqua, Tonik Donlonzi, Mdulize Malgalit Wabanakiak, Tautsi, Jolene, Tautsi, Cornell, Tautsi, Haudenosaunee. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me here, for greeting me here, for making me welcome in this territory. And I hope what I have to share with you today is insightful and interesting, and I welcome questions. And one of the reworks that I did is to include more of the backstory of why I do this work and how I came to this work. So wampum is not a topic that I simply took up on my own. Oh, okay. Is that better? Is that a little better? Okay. And actually, if you can turn off those other two lights, that would be grand. Is that too dark if we do that? Ah, there we go. Is that good enough for the filming?
It will be too dark.
Too dark? Okay. There you go. We'll sort all the technology out. Okay, good. Okay. Just because it's great to be able to see these images.
They look really good. Yeah,
okay, that's a plan. So I came to this work in 2009 when 2 wampum belts surfaced for sale at Sotheby's auction house. The Haudenosaunee Standing Committee, which many of you know monitors sacred patrimonial objects and territories, contacted me to ask for assistance in tracking the provenance of one of the belts, which was an Abenaki belt. When I looked at the case history, I said, in order to track the Abenaki belt, I need to track the Mohawk belt that showed up alongside it, because there's some reason that these are together at this moment in time beyond the acquisition of the collectors who put them up for sale at Sotheby's. That led to what has now been a really remarkable collaboration with Rick Hill. It led to a search that is ongoing, and I suspect will be ongoing for years. And it led to trying to uncover exactly how it is that so much wampum went missing, where it went, and what it means. Because wampum, interestingly enough, is one of these objects. I even hesitate to call it an object, but it is a being that has a memory far beyond whatever we might ascribe to it. These tiny beads from Welk and Quahog, when they are strung together, have meanings that are visible in symbols, but they also have meanings that I believe are recoverable in the material itself. If we look at some of the archival records, this is from William Beecham's work, we see that wampum is often described as these marine shells. They're then woven into belts, and many scholars, until quite recently, swore that these belts were almost impossible to track and to identify because they circulated so widely. Here's the trick. They did circulate widely, and in many cases, even with the ever-growing tree belt, having seen the originals of these, I can tell you that many of the traditional wampum belts contain older belts within them. So there is a practice within indigenous communities of incorporating older objects into existing objects. Wampum became endangered in the late 1800s when Haudenosaunee leaders at Six Nations and elsewhere made what seemed like a tactical strategy at the time, but in retrospect is a tactical error, to share much of their knowledge with anthropologists and historians. They invited men like Horatio Hale to come to the communities to photograph the chiefs holding these wampum belts, explain what each of them meant, then created photographs that circulated to museums around the world. And the message was meant to be, this is our cultural patrimony, these are our objects, here is how we use them, here is what they mean. Unfortunately, that message transformed into an advertising circular for sacred objects, because as chiefs started to grow old, as collectors came in some cases as the children of wampum keepers saw these objects as being accessible and valuable, within 20 years of these photographs being circulated, almost all of these wampum belts had left native hands and ended up in hands of collectors and museums. So for the following decades, for literally decade after decade, Haudenosaunee leaders were at the forefront of demanding the return of cultural patrimony, demanding the return of wampum as sacred objects. Their efforts were so intensive that it led to people believing that wampum was only Haudenosaunee, that somehow it had only been used by the 5 Nations and then 6 Nations Iroquois, and that no one else ever had it and should all go back to Haudenosaunee people. Those appeals continued into the New York State Museum in the 1970s, when a number of laws were passed to try to recover it. And when wampum finally did start to be recovered, an interesting twist happened that nobody could have predicted. The museums, which had been the keepers of these objects for so many decades, had ascribed their own meanings and their own identifications, and in many cases, those museum IDs took the place of traditional or tribal IDs and skewed the history. So even when wampum belts were returned, they were not necessarily what they were said to be. The meanings ascribed to them were not necessarily their origins. Even the tribal identities were not necessarily accurate. And then men like William Fenton called tribal leaders out and challenged them to identify the belts. In that case, he was asking people who had not seen these objects in their lifetime to identify blindly which ones were which. It was really an unfair comparison. So it created another level of confusion in that some of the belts did indeed go back to the tribal nations they were meant to be in the keeping of. Other belts were now in a new situation. So how do you sort through this? In many museums, even today, this is at the National Museum of the American Indian in DC, wampum is still displayed as though it is this exotic, unknowable, mysterious object. And by the way, I have conscripted 2 archivists to act out how mysterious and wonderful and awesome it is. But honestly, this is how museums display it and talk about it. They want you to see it as remarkable, and they want you to imagine that there is no way to uncover the meaning of it beyond its exoticism. So that leads to what I call restorative research. The Sotheby's case took quite literally 9 years to resolve. I'm happy to say those belts have gone back to their tribal communities. That's a long story in itself. But I realized along the way that what was necessary was what I call restorative research, which is not simply matching up each object to a particular community and a particular document in history, but really untangling the whole situation. I have the great good fortune to be working with Rick Hill, and my 2 research assistants, Lise Puyo and Stephanie Mock, have been just invaluable. If you want some sense of just how far this research has gone, this is not a complete list. These are the museums where I've surveyed wampum so far, and a few years into this project, tribal nations started contacting me and asking me to also come and look at their wampum. Onondaga and Akwesasne, and at the 6 Nations recitation of the Great Law, I was asked to come and examine wampum belts there. So what I've developed over this time, and I hesitate to even say that I have developed this, because what has happened over this time is that these objects have become visible in ways that they were always known to their makers and to their nations of origin, but they were made invisible to everyone else. And so somehow I feel sometimes like I have stepped through that veil of invisibility, and I am seeing something that has always been there. So perhaps it's perhaps it has to do with my approach, my vision. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that every time I encounter these objects, I try very hard not to bring my own biases and preconceptions to them, but I simply approach them to see what they might have to say, what messages might still be encoded in them. And I put out a phrase last night when I was talking with Jolene. It was sensory analysis. I do material analysis, I do documentary analysis, but I also do a sensory analysis. So let me explain some of how that works. If you were to approach a belt like this is one of the quote-unquote William Penn belts. So it is a belt made by the Lenape people to give to William Penn to recognize the fact that the colony is being allowed, the English colony is being allowed to set up in Lenape territory. And the Lenape people at that time in the 1680s said, we have ample land. We live between and among 3 rich rivers. We can live here in this land together if we have an understanding where we live side by side and do not interfere with one another. It's a version of the two-row wampum, but it's one where the parties are holding hands because they are agreeing to live within that territory. So if I tell you that is what was understood in the written documentation and the oral documentation that persists to the present day, you can see it in the belt itself. You can see in the binary signaling of wampum that in general, white signifies ease and peace and harmony and abundance. Dark signifies complexity, potential difficulty. Things are not always perfectly clear. So the figures are dark, the rivers are dark, but the land is abundant. And there's been a lot of argument about this belt, trying to figure out which figure is which. So many scholars will say this must be William Penn because he's bigger and he has a big hat. But if you listen to the words that are in the oral documentation, the Lenape chiefs are saying, you are small and you are weak, and we will take you by the hand and we will feed you and we will allow you to live here. So now I ask you, which figure is conceptually larger? And it matters. When I go into collections, as you may have already figured out from what Jolene said about my credentials, I am perfectly happy to deploy my own position of privilege as a university professor at the University of Pennsylvania, as someone who has expertise in museums, but I deploy it on behalf of the objects and the nations for whom I do work. So I do not go in with this sort of fetishistic desire to acquire all knowledge of wampum. Instead, I go in almost as a research and rescue effort. So it's always interesting when a collection is made visible to me. In many cases, a museum needs permission in advance. So in this case, the McCord Museum asked for permission from the Haudenosaunee Standing Committee and from the Gayogohó Mohawk and from the Huron-Wendat people, because these are the belts that are in their collections. And in all of these cases, I do not go in with repatriation in mind foremost. Now, I know that may sound odd because you're probably thinking, well, don't you want to get these objects home? If I was to move too quickly, I might end up recreating some of the confusion that's been before by finding a way to quickly get an object back to its source. There might be something else there to see that I don't yet know, and perhaps even the tribal nations don't yet know. So for instance, in this particular collection, there are wampum belts that signify agreements by the Huron-Wendat and Gayogohó Mohawk to accept the Jesuits and the Sulpicians in their territory, to set up churches together. And sometimes I wonder if those belts were to go back to those tribal nations, would that be a way of sort of bringing the Jesuits and Sulpicians back and saying, okay, come on in, you can live here again. And I'm not sure those nations necessarily want that. I deploy what I call restorative methodologies. To me, these make sense. I can't imagine any other way of doing this research, but they are not common, which I find very interesting, even among museum professionals. So probably the most remarkable finding, if I was to talk about discoveries, is that I looked so closely at the raw materials and component parts that I noticed things that curators had not seen. Motions of repair and reconstruction and reuse and anomalous materials. Archival research, this is fairly straightforward, but many people don't do it quite to this depth, because I try to reconstruct all the patterns of correspondence. If I know there is a letter on one end, I try to find evidence of the surviving letter on the other end, and sometimes through that correspondence, I can figure out which collectors were looking for what and how they passed it on, and even how much they got for it, and which museum they sold it to. Object cartography is basically mapping where these objects go in space and time, because again, following the objects helps us to reconstruct the trails, and I've found other missing objects by doing this. But this is sort of key. I do not trust earlier scholars unless I know where they got their information and how they got their information and who they were working for and who they were reporting to. Because I can document many instances where quite literally museum historians were making things up based on what they thought something should be. William Fenton was sort of key among them, unfortunately. and then importantly, collaborative conversations in the archives. So let me show you a little bit of what that looks like. Sometimes it gets rather amusing because I come into a museum and the curators want to give me everything. They want to hand me a stack of papers, they want to tell me everything they know, they want me to read all the catalogs, and I say no. Let me just talk with the objects first. Let me just sit with them and see what they say. And so at the Denver Art Museum, for example, I was told that this is an Apache wampum belt, that it was made by Apache prisoners from beads gotten from New England, and that it was woven in prison in the 1880s. And not a single part of that made sense except the beads from New England. The Apache do not have a wampum tradition. They were not imprisoned in the 1880s in the location the curators said they were. I don't know how that attribution got assigned to that belt, but it's also not a wampum belt, it's a wampum collar. So it's a classic example of a Wabanaki, Micmac, Maliseet, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, or Abenaki collar. These were used as decorative adornment and also as signals of particular status and groups within the community. They are often mistaken for wampum belts because it is a similar weaving pattern, but they're very distinct in and of themselves. And so looking for these distinctions tells me a great deal, but I also, I hesitate to say this on a recording, I deploy spies. I deploy anyone who can get into a collection and find information that's necessary to recovering knowledge. So when Lise Pouillot came to work with me, she is from France, she is fully fluent in French, and she has become a remarkable young scholar in and of her own status, in that she is able to move fluidly into and out of French collections in a way that I am not, to speak with fluent French speakers in a way that reveals knowledges I might not otherwise learn. One of the most amusing conversations I overheard, because we record all of our conversations in the archives and in the collections, we were looking at a wampum belt and the curator spoke only French, which I understand but do not speak well. And I overheard the curator saying to Lise, "This professor of yours, the way she is looking at this wampum, does it speak to her? Does she believe it has animacy and agency?" And Lise said, "She is my professor, and I am not at leave to speculate about her beliefs. You should ask her." And of course, the curator did not ask me. But I love the fact that I have that recording, because that's the other thing I am attuned to. In many cases, I am studying how people relate to one another around these objects and how their relationships reveal or conceal important knowledges. In this particular case, this is Stephanie Mock, who's Navajo, my other key research assistant. We're at the Canadian Museum of History, and we are analyzing two wampum belts that, like the two that surfaced for Sotheby's, were part of this acquisition of valuable objects during the early 20th century. In 1913, Frank Speck purchased 4 wampum belts. They all came from Gayogohó. 2 of them had been sent originally by Onondaga. One was a 5-diamond wampum belt representing the Five Nations Confederacy. One was a 6-diamond wampum belt. Those 2 have both since been repatriated. But these 2, which were part of the same batch, so to speak, are still at the Canadian Museum of History. And it's going to be a little bit of a longer road to bring those home, because we believe that they came from the Algonquin community. And if you know your history, at this moment in time in the 1700s and 1800s, Algonquin and Nipissing people were living with the Gayogohó Mohawk, in part because all of them had sort of agreed and sort of been coerced to leave territories in Montreal and elsewhere and live with the Sulpicians. And I think you all know how that went, not particularly well. That's a long story. Something else has been interesting in the way this has been happening is that the more that I go into collections, the more that curators become allies and colleagues in this effort and share with me things they might not have said otherwise. Because I don't go in demanding to know what they want to tell me. I simply create a space where we can talk about it. And it's become kind of entertaining, because in some cases I'll go into a collection and suddenly faculty and students and visiting scholars come out of the woodwork because they all want to know, what am I seeing? And I find it funny because these objects are with them all the time. And I simply come from another place to look at them, but I'm able to open up visibilities that are not, as I said, visible. So for instance, it's not shown in this photograph, but there's a wampum belt that lives at the Peabody Harvard Museum that I call the trouble belt. And it is one of the few objects I am very uncomfortable getting close to. I insist upon wearing gloves if I have to touch it. I prefer not to wear gloves unless I'm forced to. But I call it the trouble belt because it is completely coated with blood. And as you may or may not know, with wampum, you can turn a perfectly peaceful object into an object of war if you coat it with blood and send it out. That can change the message in and of itself. We don't know a lot about the history of it. It does need some work, but it's going to take a lot of effort and also some extra help to bring people in to figure out what to do with it. So it's one that I don't show, and I only mention it as a way of saying that some of these objects are very powerful and are dangerous. And I'm fully aware of that. So I try to be very careful in how I approach them. Now, I realize this is part of where I was restructuring what to tell you, because I always get way ahead of myself because I want to tell you the case histories, but some of you may or may not know what wampum is and how it's constructed. So here's your quick tutorial on what wampum is. So wampum is a Wampanoag word. It means white shell. It is applied to both white shell and purple shell. The beads come from these two beings which happen to live in the same waters. So we're talking whelk and quahog. The white beads come from the very youngest whelk, the central columns of the youngest whelk. The purple beads come from the outer edges of the oldest quahog. You can see a little chunk there. And so ideally, you get very, very white beads from the very young whelk and very, very dark beads from the very old quahog. So these extremes of color. And they live in the same waters and they predate on each other. So they can literally survive by eating each other. So think about that. They have to live in the same waters, both salt and fresh, at the edges of the ocean and the rivers. They can consume each other. They have this binary relationship. Isn't it so interesting to create an object of peace out of these two beings that can feast on one another? You can just think about that. So when I first went into the Yale collections, I asked Yale to show me all of their shell, because they said, we have no wampum belts, we have nothing of interest. I said, great, show me your shells. And they have a wonderful array of cabinets that goes all along the floor. They stretch from here a little past the wall of this room, and they are also lined up along Long Island Sound. So pieces collected from down near New York City all the way out to Rhode Island. And right in the middle are some of the perfect materials from which wampum is made. And also, right in the middle, is a rather large collection that came from Fort Shantok, which is Mohegan territory. Now, the Mohegan were amazing wampum producers. They made vast quantities of wampum, and as it happens, the archaeological material collected from that site reflects that wampum production. And the archaeologists knew what they were doing in this case. They were collecting in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but they sorted things very nicely for us. So here you see the columns taken out of the whelk. There's some other tools in here as well. And then here you see the bits of sandstone that you would use to sand those columns down until they're perfectly tubular. These are the beads that would result. And not only does this collection contain beads, but it also contains some broken beads and some metal bits. So I can't tell you for a fact that this is the bit that drilled that bead, but as you can see, it fits. But here's another interesting thing about wampum. Wampum can be made with any tool that you can turn into a bit and fit into a bow drill and push through the shell. If any of you have ever tried making wampum, it's incredibly difficult to do it in the present day because the shell casts out a lot of dust that's very, very toxic. It shatters if you don't drill it properly. And it's taken a long time to figure out what was the art, because we know native people were creating so much wampum and it was coming out so beautifully, you know. But here's the thing, you'll note the difference in size of these openings. You know, they're all over the map. This is all from one particular collection. But when you drill, you're drilling from each side to the middle. These tiny beads drilling from each side to the middle. If the drills, you know, if your two steps of drilling meet, you have a perfectly tubular opening. If they don't, you have an offset opening, as you can see here. And if your drill wobbles, anybody ever work with a bow drill? You get a conical opening. So this is interesting because William Fenton swore that you could tell the tools that were being used by whether the beads had a conical opening or a tubular opening. And I can tell you that's simply not true. It's all got to do with how good you are at working the drill and whether you are drilling your beads fresh or old. When the shell is fresh and young, it's very easy to drill. Now, the other thing about Yale's Fort Shantok collection is that it was very well identified. The archaeologists left little notes. So one piece of shell wampum perforated, there you see it in my hand, from Fort Shantok, and also collected nails that have been repurposed to use as drills. Because it's a truism that indigenous people use whatever is available for the needs at hand. So if you've got English nails in abundance, that's what you'll use. And then Frank Speck conveniently collected some of these bow drills. And I love this one. This is the Canadian Museum of History, because here's a traditional small bow. There's a spool from a woolen mill that's being reused as the spindle. And then there's a nail that's been sharpened to use as the bit. So what that adds up to is that these material insights were new in terms of wampum study, because people had not noticed this use of old and young, this extreme light and dark. It's true that much of the oldest wampum is very dark, so dark that it's almost black, but that has to do with the shell it's coming from. And then all of these distinctive patterns, but then I'll show you some examples of these. The intentional use of what we call anomalous beads, so beads that don't quite fit in, beads that are sort of unusual, glass, stone, or other shell. The inclusion of beads marked with ochre or vermilion, the prevalence of dogbane and leather, these are the most common things being used, and then distinctive weaving patterns. So when these started becoming visible, when these objects started calling themselves out to me, that's when things really got interesting. Because a classic wampum belt, let's just date these from the early 1600s to late 1700s, which we know are firm dates on all of these, but a classic wampum belt has leather for warp and has dogbane or some kind of plant fiber, milkweed, or what we call Indian hemp. Dogbane is the most common for weft. It makes for a very sturdy belt. But you can notice right away some differences in the ends of these belts. Subtle differences, whether it's tied off or left open, whether there's an extra row. And then in this case, I'm hoping you can see it. This is why I wanted the lights well dimmed for you. Do you see the red on some of these strands of leather? Do you see the pinch marks? If you line these up, the pinch marks do not line up. And some of these don't have extra pinches. That's where we're seeing repurposed warp. So literally someone took a belt apart, reused the warp, had to create new weft, because the weft will just disintegrate if you don't. But that tells you something. And then even here, can you see the little bit of red ochre? Somebody didn't go in with a paintbrush and put that in there. No, that's what happens if there's ochre on someone's hands when they're handling it, or if the belt itself was coated with ochre, or if you're gathering up beads that came out of something else that was coated with ochre. So that's when things started to get interesting. And then, can anyone see the glass bead in these slides? How good are your eyes? I'll give you a clue. It's a blue glass bead. You see it?
Yeah.
Where is it?
It's in that bottom of that white row. Oh,
Yeah.
there, turn around.
Nope, it's right there. So, do you see it? Yeah. I'll show you some others. So here's the weaving pattern. I was talking to Jolene about this last night. There is what I call the traditional weaving pattern. And the traditional weaving pattern is structurally sound and conceptually related, because every row is linked to every other row, which is then linked to the next row. So Frank Speck thankfully did this illustration for us. But here's how they go. So your weft threads are going around the warp. What you can't see is that inside every bead, the weft threads are twisting. So around the warp, twist inside, separate around the warp again. And then here is what I call a single cross. As they cross at the bottom, they loop over. Everybody see that? Mm-hmm. So that makes for it really structurally sound. Today, virtually every wampum maker, only a few are starting to catch on to the old technique, but virtually everybody does an up and down weave. So they literally will go up and then down and then up and then down and up and down. That's different. It doesn't hold together in the same way. And then when you look at the edges of belts, you can see these distinctions. So there's a single cross. There's a double cross. You see that cross and loop around. And then this is wonderful, because this is a belt that was woven with sinew, but sinew breaks down over time. And so instead of taking it apart, someone then wove in hemp to anchor it together and used a double cross here, a loop there, and a single cross here. Can you see those details? So again, these objects have been saying this all along. And what we're seeing is the hands of the makers who put these together, the hands of the people who repaired them, who used them, who reused them. And so in a funny way, people got so focused on the iconography that they didn't even notice the structure. And frankly, I think the structure is as important, if not more important, than the iconography. So here's an example. This is one of the belts that lives in the Cord Museum. It's called the Two-Dog Wampum Belt from Gayogohó. We know for a fact that the belt was created when the Gayogohó Mohawk invited the Sulpicians to set up a mission. Now, one might say, oh, but didn't the French give the land to the Sulpicians? Well, that's one way of thinking of it. Gayogohó Mohawk say, no, we agreed that they could do this if we lived together, if we held it all up together. We agreed that we would all hold up the mission that would be planted in the land. So that's the mission, conceptually. There's the land. You see how it's broken by the cross. It's planted in the land. Then these figures on either side, these are Sulpicians, these are native figures. So you see how they go along the belt. Each figure is slightly different. And this is another interesting thing. Everyone that makes reproduction wampum, they take these figures and they make them exactly the same and they run them along the belt. But that's not what the originals did. The original objects show that difference because they want to show these are different people, different groups. They're representing a large population. So even here, you see the slight distinction here, the difference in the hips. See how the head is turned? It's not centered. It's looking at the cross. So what are the Sulpicians focusing on? They're all about the church. But meanwhile, at the ends of the belt, something else altogether is happening. Because the native leaders are saying, we're going to keep an eye out on things. Our dogs are going to look after us and warn us if any trouble comes. And we will watch in the opposite directions. And so you see how this figure's head is off to the side, looking off the end of the belt. And see how this dog, with the use of 2 half beads, there's a whole white bead and then a half white bead, is slightly off the ground, poised and moving. These may seem subtle, and they're not accidental. Trust me, the amount of effort it takes to weave these objects, you do not simply run out of beads and decide to use some half beads. No, you put them in there very intentionally. And then on the other end of the same belt, on the other end of the same belt, this dog is completely off the ground. So there must be some real danger coming from somewhere in the west. In the east, it's just enough to be ready, but already ready to move in the west. But then again, here's another detail. The Gayogohó Mohawks brought this belt out frequently to remind the Sulpicians when things were going wrong. And at one point, the Sulpicians said, this isn't what you think it is. This belt is not a treaty. This belt is not proof of anything. And you claim this belt has been underground, but we see no trace of dirt on it. Well, I agree there's no dirt on it, but it has been underground. If you use the term underground to say undercover, it has been concealed, it has been used, it has been handled pretty roughly in some cases, and it's been repaired. So can you see the repairs? And can you also see that this belt was made up of other belts? Other belts that had red ochre in them, see there's the repurposed warp. And then I like to call this indigenous repair or Indian repair, which is using whatever's at hand to hold it together. If it's museum repair, it would be very fine and very detailed and try to make it almost indiscernible. But native repair is like, nope, got to stitch it together. That's what you do. So this belt shows all signs of having been existing in older belts and older beads, of having been brought together for that purpose, of having been carefully curated and repaired and handled over time. And there are Gayogohó Mohawk who would argue that that agreement should still hold, but again, if you take the belt back, do you take the Sulpicians back? I don't know. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of this argument, and I hate to say William Fenton more than once in a talk like this, But he published an article in 1971 that was about wampum, where he argued that it was as American as apple pie, that the Haudenosaunee had completely reinvented a system that was lost to memory, and that the Hiawatha Wampum Belt was not old because it contained a single glass bead. That was the structure of the argument. Can anyone see the glass bead? It's a little harder to see in this image. Nope, this is, yeah, sometimes people think it's this, but that's just a wonky quahog bead.
4 up from the tip of the tree to the right.
The shiny beads.
It's right there.
Yeah.
You see it? It's funny, once you spot it, then you can't not see it. That's what I find is interesting about these glass beads. So yes, this belt has a single glass bead in it. I've now looked at every single bead in the belt, and as you can see, Rick Hill is there helping me do it. But it also has been through a lot. It's been completely rebuilt. It's been repaired multiple times. It has a lot of breakage. At one point, it was exposed to fire. I don't know how many of you know this story, but when the New York State Museum burned in 1911, and most of the collections were left, and Arthur Parker was quite literally crawling through the museum with a Haudenosaunee pipe axe, trying to, break down the burning timbers, the wampum belts were kept in a case, and the legs of the case burned, but the wampum belts did not. They came out of that fire intact. And so that could be where some of this is coming from. It's also a little hard to tell because Arthur Parker also took the belts that were in his care and stitched all of them to a cotton burlap backing. You can see the backing here, and they're stuck to that backing even today, and discussions have been had about whether or not these should be freed from that museum trapping. Because what's happening now is that these objects are no longer able to move. They are brought out periodically for ceremonial purposes, but they can't flex, they can't breathe the way they once did. So to go back to looking for anomalous beads, I bet you can see this blue glass bead. Is it visible now? Yeah. Now it leaps out at you. Your eyes have been trained. So now can you see the steatite bead? Anyone? Yeah, it's right here. Steatite, soapstone. And then, this is a great one. How about the glass beads here? Got them? This is a wampum belt that was made by the Huron-Wendat to send to Chartres Cathedral. It lives there still today. And when it was first analyzed by scholars, they said, oh, obviously, the Jesuits must have put these glass beads in, or perhaps the Indians didn't have enough wampum beads, so they simply put them in there, or maybe it was a decorative touch. There is so much going on with these glass beads because they are only in the Latin words of the belt. This is a belt that speaks to the Virgin Mary, and it asks the Virgin Mary to look out for the Huron-Wendat, to handle them as though they were her children, to speak on their behalf with the French. And so in the Latin words is where these beads occur. They do not occur in the background of the belt, which represents Huron-Wendat territory, and they do not occur in the word Huronium, which says Huron-Wendat territory. And Lise has analyzed this belt very closely, and she's found that if you start counting the beads, even where they seem to be unbalanced, that you can actually speak a Hail Mary and a Pater Noster on these beads as you count them along the letters. But the other thing I like pointing out is that this figure is unusual in a religious wampum belt because it is a version of the dish with one spoon. You know what I mean when I say the dish with one spoon? The dish with one spoon is both a belt and a concept. So here's the belt, here's a close-up of the belt. So if we kind of break it down, symbolically it's a dish within a large territory. So open territory, shared dish. Practically, it communicates an intertribal agreement to co-occupy that territory and steward the natural resources. Ontologically, so what's the knowledge embedded in here? It embodies reciprocal relations among humans and with other than humans. And I love pointing this out because people sometimes look at the dish and all they're thinking about is food, or they're thinking about people. They're not thinking that resources includes other living beings. So this is not just humans taking whatever they want. This is animals and plants and birds and fish and everyone in that system, so everyone in a way is eating out of the dish, and if you keep the dish clean, everyone will survive. And then politically, this is what John Skanawati-Buck told us about this. He said, they entered into one great league, contract that they will all be one and have one heart. The spot is a dish of beaver, indicating they will have one dish, and what belongs to one will belong to all. So again, a case where the words and the belt and all of this fits together. So another example. This is called a French alliance belt. We don't know a great deal about its history other than that it comes from the late 1500s. It's been through a fair bit. It's been abused. The museum has, this lives at the Canadian Museum of History. It's been repaired several times. But what's interesting about this one to me is that it represents an alliance where initially both parties to the alliance have weapons and are prepared to use them. But they agreed to take hold of what is called a covenant chain. So this is a classic covenant chain belt. In a covenant chain, you take hold of the chain and you hold it up together. And if you have a weapon, you put it down. Because if you're holding it up, you've got hold of your partner and you might hurt them. But if you put it down, you've agreed that you will look after each other and not make war on one another. But does anyone notice that this belt's been altered? Yeah. These have been cut. And the weapon's removed. So this party's been neutered. I don't know by who, but I do know that this alteration was made before it came to the museum. So this is another case where I can tell you that in this iteration, which this is sometimes what I call a, there's not a good term for it, but this belt is in its original iteration. It shows no signs of having been made with beads that came from something else. No sign of repurposed wampum or weft or warp. So this is the original end. You can see the end of that leather. But this you can see where it's cut, and you can see the pinches that match up that indicate it went on. So there was more going on this particular end, and you can even see the few strands left here. So again, we can break this one down. Two figures, both parties must hold it up, shared space. And I always also like pointing out that to have a weapon and ground it is a much more powerful message than to have a weapon and use it, or to have no weapon. But there's a funny thing that happens when wampum gets reinterpreted. I'm sure many of you have seen reproduction wampum belts or flags or tattoos or a number of things where these symbols are being used widely by native and by non-native people. And sometimes when wampum belts get reproduced, not only is there what I call an artificial uniformity, there's an attempt to make them absolutely perfect and pristine, but there's also an alteration of the message. 3 reproductions of that belt live at the Canadian Museum of History. One of them was made out of bits of insulation wire that were snipped to replicate wampum. One of them was made out of glass beads. So look at the original and look at the repros. The repros have no weapons at all. It's like, wait a minute, that's an entirely different message. That's like, we are both vulnerable, so let's hold on to this chain, you know, and keep an eye out for somebody who can help us. So it's funny when you think about it, because are these still political objects? Are they still significant if they carry a different message? I don't really know the answer, but they're different. And then there's another way of altering a message, which is to take the belt apart altogether, take the beads out, and put them into a weapon of war, and that's sort of unmistakable. And so I've now been looking at a number of these war clubs. There are about 8 that survive around the world. I'm sure there were once more. And every single one, the beads show traces of having been in a wampum belt previously. All the beads are drilled. They all retain traces of the fiber. And boy, that's a very different message. And I realize I'm not stopping for questions, so I'll just carry on, and then we can do questions afterwards. So part 3 is sort of wrapping this up, what I call conversations in recovery, because where am I going with all of this? I'm trying to get to a place where I'm encouraging people to talk about objects, not just wampum, but using wampum as an example of a very significant category of objects that has been poorly handled, poorly understood, often mistreated and misused. And there's got to be a way to repair that. And it requires a lot of conversation. And the conversation can't just be arguments between claimants and museums. Something else has to happen. So when I work with curators and they are drawn in to see something they had never noticed before, that's significant. When I visit tribal museums, in this case Tamaquag museums, and people are trying to reclaim their own traditions of making wampum because they are tired of museums telling them the right or wrong way to do it. When I visit museums, and in this case at the Canadian Museum, I find a wampum belt in their collections that matches in structure and form, although different in length, but matches a wampum belt that lives at the Penn Museum. Suddenly I have found something. I have found that these objects are sisters to one another. And what their relation is beyond that, I don't quite know, but I can tell you that the same tradition was used in making each of them at the same time period. In collections like the Rock Foundation, the Rochester Museum, George Hamill has been enormously helpful. And in some cases, by looking at archaeological wampum, we are learning things that we can discern elsewhere in other kinds of beads. And then in this case, this was actually really a very entertaining moment, because when I first came to the University of Pennsylvania, Penn has two wampum belts in its collections. One is a 14 diamond belt and one is a path belt. They have been in the museum since the 19-teens and nobody knew anything about them. And within a few months, I was able to find a great deal about them. Not only by inviting in Peter Jemison, but also by really looking through the details. And this is one of the things I added this morning because I thought it was an interesting story you would appreciate. This is a collar, this is a belt, and this is the path belt. The path belt came to the Penn Museum as a purchase from Walter Wyman for $500 in 1920. That's quite a lot from wampum at that time period. The museum had all the records, including a copy of the money order that was used to buy it, the correspondence between the director of the museum, George Byron Gordon, and the seller, Walter Wyman, who actually sold a number of wampum belts. But no one had been able to find anything beyond that. And I thought, well, surely I can do something here. And one scholar said, well, perhaps it was associated with Reverend Elkanah Holmes. Somehow he's connected to it. And it's like, aha, okay, now I know where to go. So I obsessively read through all of the missionary journals that were published during Elkanah Holmes' lifetime. I don't know that I read all of them, but I read a lot of them. And about 3 days into it, I found this letter. This is from, so Mexicanuk is obviously Stockbridge Mohican Indians, writing to the New York Baptist Association, thanking the association for sending Elkanah Holmes, whom we look upon as our father, welcoming him, and then a belt of wampum delivered. In most colonial documents, that's all you get, a belt of wampum delivered. You read through the Sir William Johnson papers and you will find several thousand belts of wampum delivered. You also will find references to the fact that sometimes a belt is given and then behind the scenes someone is taking it apart to turn it into something else for another meeting. So not all of those have survived. So that might seem like a dead end until you go to the next page. And on the next page it conveniently says, we are given to understand that the belt mentioned above is more than 2 feet in length and 3 inches in breadth, consisting of 8 rows of pure wampum, 2 of which are purple, signifying a plain, wide path. The other 6 rows, denoting the 6 nations of Indians, are white, implying peace. 3 rows on each side of the path, implying safety and liberty for each party to pass and repass to visit each other. At each end of the belt or path is a square formed of purple and white wampum, signifying the Mexicanuk Nation of Indians and the New York Baptist Association united in love and friendship. Wonderful. So first of all, how many groups are in the Haudenosaunee there? There's 6. So Tuscarora is part of this. Then this wider path to travel. It's an unmistakable path belt. Then you'll notice the path continues out the ends of the belt. It doesn't just stop there. But then something odd happens when you try to match this up to the territory. It's like, well, wait a minute. Let's kind of look at New York State. Like, okay, you know, we got Tuscarora and Seneca and Cayuga and Onondaga and Oneida and Mohawk, but wait, Stockbridge and Mohican are here, and the American Baptist Missionary Society is down here in New York City. Like, this belt doesn't go between them. Or even if you move Stockbridge to Oneida, which they were in the process of moving to, it still doesn't go between 6 nations. So what I believe happened, and I don't yet have the documentation, is that this was a belt made for a different purpose. Somewhere between the 1720s and the 1790s, this belt was made as a sort of passport. So someone could travel across what we now call New York, among and through all of those nations. And so to test that hypothesis, I thought, well, let's see if anyone else saw this belt in that time period and said something. And guess what? Red Jacket recognized that belt. Because when Reverend Elkanah Holmes came to visit with him, he said, you know, we recognize you. We know that you called on our brothers, the Oneidas and Mexicanucks. We thank them for the pains they have taken in sending this good talk with wampum, at the same time holding the talk and wampum in his hand. We are convinced that what they say of you is true, that you come purely out of love. I don't know that that was entirely true, but that's a conversation for another time. But suffice to say that this message was unmistakable in this belt. This is what it was meant to do. Because you are carrying it, we trust you. What I think happened is the Oneida may have given this belt to the Stockbridge to enable them to travel. And then the Stockbridge, perhaps expediently, decided to give it to a missionary. And the missionary went on with it. And I was able to find that the missionary held on to it, passed it on to his son, passed on to his grandson, who sold it to a collector, who sold it to the museum, and the story was lost. So when I showed up at Penn, it got a little worse than that, because not only was the story lost, but the director of the Penn Center for Native American Studies decided to use the belt as a logo. And here's the problem, right? So first of all, you know, here's a photograph of the belt. People do this sometimes, which is terrible. They'll take a belt and twist it and tangle it around. It's like, they're not meant to be like that. They're not meant to be twisted like that. And then assigning a new meaning altogether. So in this case, it's a friendship belt. Suddenly it's not a path belt. It denotes the enduring friendship between the University of Pennsylvania and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Like, what? It covers the whole continent now? Similar friendship belts are used by the Iroquois and other tribes to mark treaties between nations. Not exactly. The squares can be interpreted as the two nations engaged in treaty making. At the centers of the squares are the two governments or council fires. Connecting the squares is a pathway representing the free interchange of peoples and ideas between the groups. The inspiration for the logo is a wampum belt in the collections of the Penn Museum. Now, I hope you can see the problems, that this is a distortion of wampum symbolism, but it's beyond a distortion, because wampum is binary. It is dark and light. Every now and then you get purple beads that aren't quite perfectly dark, or white beads that are a little dark. That's fine, but it's dark and light. When you color wampum by putting something else on it, you alter the message. So to take two squares that are white to signify a safe space and fill them in with red, or in this case a bluish purple, red signifies go here and die. So obviously that is no longer a logo used at the Penn Museum. So relational insights are something that should be more common in the way all of us work with one another. And because of the legacy of colonization, because of the distortion of so much indigenous knowledge, it can be difficult sometimes to get people to work together. But I'm very pleased that this is one of the big successes of the Wampum Trail, is that by getting people to sort of think reflexively and reflectively and consider what they know and why they know it, it makes room to think differently. So I pull, as I say, museum curators, archivists, and students in as scouts, and I realize that the stories we tell about objects change over time based on who we are, where we're positioned, what it is we as communities intend to do with those objects. And sometimes there are stories still embedded in especially wampum belts that need to be told in a very different way. So I had asked Jolene about this, and the one last thing I decided to add to this to you today, because I could obviously go on forever, is that this is a set of wampum belts that I am very much looking forward to seeing at some point. They're currently undercover, but they belonged to the Algonquin people when they lived at Gayogohó. They're now known as the Kitiganzabi and Rapid Lake Algonquin of Lac Barrière. In 1914, they were visited by Frank Speck, who I believe took this photograph. And this is a copy of the photograph that the community gave to me when I was there visiting them. And you'll notice that they have two path belts. They have strings. This is a small belt here that shows three figures holding hands and a cross. And then this is a belt that has 7 diamonds, and the central diamond is doubled. So without going into great detail about the meanings of these particular belts, they were sent undercover, quite literally sent to the north and hidden in the chinks of a log cabin to keep them out of the eyes of the Mounties. At the same time period when the Haudenosaunee of Six Nations at Grand River were losing wampum belts, Mounties started looking for them to confiscate them because they were markers of old treaties and old alliances. So the Kitiganzabi Algonquin decided to hide their wampum belts. And when they brought them out again, they brought them out and they handed them into the keeping of Clinton Rickard. And when Clinton Rickard was the keeper of them, they took on very, very different meanings. They were widely photographed, they were widely displayed, and perhaps the most powerful action they were engaged in was to open the Niagara border. Because in the aftermath of World War I, it was difficult, if not impossible, for Native people to go back and forth across that border. And Rickard thought these belts had the power to do it. And so here he is marching with them. People are carrying them and wearing them, along with Algonquin chiefs. And this is also tangled in with the moment in time when Tuskahee passes away. And so there's a lot of effort on both sides of the border to kind of keep these objects out and use them as tools of power. But when Rickard died, they went back to Kitiganzabi. They lived in the hands of William Commanda for a number of years, and when Commanda died, they went undercover again. And that's where they are now. And it's interesting that 3 times now I've been invited to Kitiganzabi to talk about these wampum belts and have not yet seen them, and most people in the community have not yet seen them. And they're all waiting to decide what the right time is and when they should be brought out and what they should do with them now. Because the meanings don't necessarily change over time, but the belts retain a certain amount of power depending on what you choose to do with them. And so in closing, I am always going to be deeply indebted to Rick Hill for welcoming me into this research. He had been pursuing wampum research for 30 years, including much of the repatriation efforts. He was instrumental in those. And as he's noting here with Stephanie, these reproduction belts are useful, and in some cases they take the place of belts that are not in people's hands right now, but they're very different objects. And it was Rick who saw to it that we were invited to the recital of the Great Law. This was in 2015, and this was the first moment at one of those recitals when the historic belts were picked up. Before that, they were simply displayed flat, because one of the agreements, you may or may not know this, but the Haudenosaunee and other nations who received objects back from museums sometimes had to sign agreements that they would keep those objects undercover in protected cases. They would be in climate-controlled safes. They would be in vaults. They would not be altered. They would not be repaired. They would not be changed in any way. They would not be handled. And there was a point at which many of the tribal nations that got these objects back said, no, they need to be handled. These are like relatives coming home. We can't simply keep them at a distance. And so in this particular instance, they were handled in front of the reproductions that represent them. And the Sotheby's case, remember the Sotheby's case I started with? The 2 Mohawk wampum belts that were held captive through a long series of actions, purchased by, well, stolen by a Frenchman, sold to Frank Speck, brought to the Penn Museum, sold to the Museum of the American Indian, gone to both New York City and DC, and finally come home in 2018 when they were finally brought back together, and I was meeting with Chief Curtis Nelson at Gayogohó. I decided to photograph them, but it was an interesting challenge because I wanted to compare them to the old photographs. So here they are in 1915, here they are in 2018, and as you can see, they are exactly the same belts. This is not Photoshop, this really is the same belts. And they are in pristine condition. And I can tell you that these are in the original form they were made in, so they were not made from repurposed beads or warps. But notice how much different and how much more alive they look when they are then picked up and held, and when they communicate. Because these are objects that are meant to be in communication. They are meant to be held. They are meant to be shown. They are meant to be handled. And similarly, when the Pledge of the Crown belt came home, this was really a wonderful moment because Alan Corbière, who is Manitoulin Island Anishinaabe, and Rick Hill, Tuscarora, are holding a belt that was sent to those nations together by the British to say thank you for being our allies in the War of 1812. And the collection that you saw at Yale of Mohegan Fort Shantok wampum has all gone home to Mohegan. That was a remarkable turn of events. We were able to convince Yale that there was no logic to holding on to 2,000 archaeological objects that bespoke wampum making when the Mohegan had a museum of their own and should get them back. And so without even going through NAGPRA, Yale decided to hand them over. And then the Wampanoag, because after all, wampum is a Wampanoag word, the Wampanoag are currently at work on creating a new wampum belt of their own making. Individuals are making the beads, individuals hunted the deer and tanned the hide, and entire communities are coming together to weave bits of it. So this belt, when it is completed, will have the hands of at least 600 wampum makers and wampum handlers and wampum weavers in it. Children, old people, anyone. They're trying to get the entire community of Aquinnah and Mashpee to be involved in some way in making this belt. So there's the Wampum Trail. It continues. I'm sure there are questions, but I thank you immensely for your patience and your interest. Olioni. So, questions?
I got two.
Go for it.
First of all, on the end of a lot of them wampum belts, there's like fingers sticking out on both ends.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know what those are, and I've never heard an explanation for
The strands or the
beads
marks?
itself, yeah, the wampum.
Oh, yes, yes. So for instance, on the, if you remember the Two Dog Wampum Belt, that was created at a time when there was a seven nations alliance, which was separate from the Haudenosaunee. So it included Huron and Abenaki and Mohawk, and there are 7 bands, and I'll come back to this to point it out to you. This is the easiest way to explain it. And the bands represent each of the nations who are part of that agreement. So when you see this, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and the 7th is Ganesatake, which is that what you meant, those figures?
Yeah, those ones,
Yeah.
I've never heard it explained what they
Yeah,
are.
they usually represent other parties to the agreement.
Okay.
And then if there's just one and it's a path belt, it represents that the path can go on indefinitely.
Yeah.
And so similarly, sometimes you'll see a rafter belt and there's room for extra rafters. Yeah.
Okay, my other question was the Hiawatha belt. Now, I've seen the original in it was supposed to be the original in I'm trying to think where. Well, anyways, the one now it looked like it's been redone, but one of the figures don't have a head.
Oh, you're thinking about the George Washington belt.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The George Washington belt is, I don't have a picture handy, but I do know exactly what you mean. So it was made by Washington to give to the Haudenosaunee, and it contains 13 figures and a house in the middle, and one of the figures is missing its head. And when I analyze that belt, it's interesting to see that it was forcibly taken out. So strands were broken, beads were pulled out, and then someone went back and put them in, but when they put them in, it's all white beads,
Yeah.
so there's no head whatsoever. So I've asked a number of people what's going on, and the only explanation I get that makes perfect sense is that's New York. You know, because that, if you think about it, that's the colony that really did the most damage in terms of breaking the alliance and the understanding. But yeah, and that's old, so that's old alteration. No museum did that. But yeah, missing a head. Yeah.
I was curious if you had any idea, like an accurate way to date the Hiawatha belt?
See, this is a case where that's an argument I don't get into, and I'll tell you why I don't get into it. We could date this iteration. Actually, I'll give you an answer this way. We can date this particular construction based on that bead. So this particular iteration of the Hiawatha belt cannot be any older than that bead. But that doesn't mean the belt is not older. It's almost like if I were to pierce my ear and wear a new earring, it doesn't mean I'm suddenly 1 year old. It just means I've got a new earring. So it's a misunderstanding, and it's almost the wrong argument. So the other way I like to think about it is that this belt could be as old as the founding of the Confederacy if it is the concept we're focused on and not the object itself. Because an object does not last forever. And so I don't believe there was a belt made at the founding, in part because nothing in the Great Law says a belt was made at the founding. It comes later. And this is where, and I apologize if I'm reiterating your tradition, but this is how I've come to understand it, that at first there are reeds from water plants. And Ayanwata puts those into strings as a form of condolence, but the reeds wear away. And then there are sticks that are hollowed out, and those are strung like beads, but they too wear away. And then there's a moment when there is an inland lake covered with ducks, and the ducks fly off the surface of the lake and take all the water with them. And shells are left behind, and those are strung. But none of those three are beads that look like this. So when these beads come into Haudenosaunee territory, they're coming from the coastal waters. They're coming from Long Island Sound, from along the mouth of the St. Lawrence, and then they're coming in and they're being used to create that same thing. So I think what has happened is that over time, different substances have been used to create what's necessary for those concepts to become material. So it's why the argument about how old this belt is almost the wrong argument. That's the way I tend to think about it. So, yeah.
So, but no one's ever tried to like date the fibers?
No, and I don't, and the reason is, to do any fiber dating, you have to destroy them. Fiber dating can only be done through burning, and I will not do that work. If a tribal nation decided to do it with a belt in their hands, that'd be one thing, but personally I don't think it's a good idea, and I wouldn't even attempt it. So it's why I say trying to ascribe a date is almost the wrong question. Not that you're asking a wrong question, you follow where I'm going here. So, other questions? Yeah.
You had mentioned in the Sir William Johnson papers that wampum belts were mentioned thousands of times. That's astounding to me.
I haven't quantified it, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Would you say thousands?
I think I would say thousands. And the reason I would, because in a typical council meeting, there are at least 10 to 20 wampum belts exchanged. And they're not going back and forth. They're brought out. And so, and I can check, because I know Rick has quantified this, and I'm sure there is a number that can be ascribed to it, so thousands might be a high number. But it explains why so many belts are not retrievable, because there simply weren't that many. If you see what I mean? It's like if they're being made and remade, then they may have only existed for a short period of time and then been taken apart to turn into something else. Whereas this is a belt that for its purposes needed to be in this particular form. And so it would, if it's taken apart, it's only to remake it in that form, which is a different kind of belt. Yeah.
So that's not to say that there are thousands of different types of belts. It's just that they were reused in different meetings.
Right. There are not thousands of belts out there.
Okay.
Yeah. I can give you a number for that. So existing wampum belts that we know of for sure, there are at least 500 existing wampum belts. I've currently only seen about 260 of them. So I've got a ways to go. And in some cases, I'm going to have to go into castles in Germany and, houses in Switzerland and, the bowels of the British Museum and, that sort of thing, which I intend to do next month, actually. But yeah, it's funny how many of them are hidden away. So, questions? Yeah.
I had one about sourcing, so you're talking about wampum beads, right? So the shells, they come from the coast. So as Tuscarora, I guess how would you, source them?
Trade.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is how do you know where they come from? You can assume they come from the coast, right? But how do you know?
It's where these beings live.
Yeah.
So they don't live in inland waters. They can't survive in fresh water. And they can be transported live to a certain degree. If you're, in fact, it's interesting. I was talking with an archaeologist who works for Haudenosaunee up in Canada, and they're working on wampum research, and they've discovered some wampum beads at Haudenosaunee during an archaeological dig to expand the museum. And we had this conversation, well, how did they get the shells this far inland, and what's going on? She says, well, they predate each other. And so all you need is a net bag trailing behind your canoe full of quahog and whelk. And by the time you get to where you're going, you simply use whichever ones are left, because even if they've eaten each other, you still have the shells. So it's entirely possible they were transported up the Hudson River or along the Mohawk River. And so we know they were transported as beads, because there are records and oral traditions of beads being traded, but maybe they were also transported as living shells, living beings in the shells. Yeah. I'm sorry, does that help? Yeah.
I'll probably ask another one later.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Pardon me, ask two questions out of my ignorance. And my first question is like in your talk you mentioned about objects like can be powerful and dangerous. Like in your project, could you please explain a little bit more like about what do you mean like powerful and dangerous? And also, I kind of noticed like there are some different spaces going on in your project, like museums, also like people try to return the belts to the indigenous communities. So I wonder whether these two places kind of overlap or cooperate to help like you or your team to unpack the puzzles. And also like related to the first question, like, which place do you think is safe or most suitable so the object, the belts like can be maintained in a good way at the same time, like you said, not being dangerous?
Boy, that's a complicated question. I hesitate to say too much about power and danger because much in the same way that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, power is in the hands of the beholder. And so there are many objects in museum collections that were never meant to be seen, never meant to be handled, never meant to be talked about. I stay away from those objects. When it comes to wampum, sometimes it's a fine line. So much of it depends upon the context in which an object was made, what it was intended to do, and the degree to which it can be used for that purpose now or for another purpose. So for example, there are, in many museum collections, condolence strings. And condolence strings were used in conjunction with particular ceremonies to condole for the lost, to bring up a new chief, for these other activities. But they are meant to be in a complete set, but many museums have taken the sets apart. Or a collector took the sets apart. So that's a case where I happen to believe these objects want to be back together and want to be back in the form they were intended for. So, but it's not up to me to decide who is the proper keeper, because I think all too often museums have put themselves forward as being climate controlled, secure, safe, appropriate repositories for indigenous materials. I do not believe that they are any of those things uniformly or reliably. And that's part of how we have the problems we have now, is that in many cases museums have been untrustworthy keepers. And in many cases, tribal nations have been vulnerable keepers, not through their own doing, but through the doing of duplicitous agents who come in among them. So that's where it is not an easy question, but these are important things to think about, and these are things about which I do not necessarily pass judgment on any particular, well, I do pass judgment on some individuals. Sorry, I take that back. But you follow where I'm going, is that it's not an easy answer. There's not a very straightforward way to address that. Yeah?
I have two questions. One is, in some of the pictures, some of the belts, the figures had a white bead in their heart. What does that mean?
It signifies a heart.
That the land is in the heart. That the heart is peaceful?
Or that the figure has a heart. You know, often, so I think you're thinking about this one, for example.
Like a good person?
No, because you'll notice, and this is an interesting case, because here is the native figure, which is lots of heart. And here's the French. Just this little bit. Yeah.
But in some of them, it's the opposite, that the European is with that.
Not that I've seen, no. Well, if you're thinking about the Sulpician belt, that's a very different thing, because this is not signifying, you'll note, it's not white. That's all dark. Yeah. So again, keep those binaries in mind. So.
Okay, so that was my first question. My second question is just about, I was really interested in the way that the belts work. in terms of them signifying an agreement? I'm trying to compare it to a contract. So is that the right comparison, or is that?
No, and the reason is because they are not
enforced like a contract. You know, how you break.
No, I mean, well, yes and no. Sometimes a belt will be a literal representation of a contract. Sometimes.
It's not the contract itself. It's a representation.
But it's the human understanding and agreement, and this is where I've come to think very differently about wampum, in that it is a unique form of embodying an understanding. So the belt itself is a being that embodies that understanding and remembers. And I can say this having been through so many instances where belts that appear to be unidentifiable suddenly become identifiable if they are brought into hands that recognize them, into communities that know them. So that's where it is more than simply a writing system. And there's been a great deal of scholarship about wampum as a form of proto-writing, or wampum as a symbolic language, or the semiotics of the symbols. And that's why it's not even as simple as saying, oh, a cross represents this and a figure it's never that easy. And even the very representational belts like this one are not the most common. The oldest belts, the most common, are abstract symbols. They are rafters, and they're crosses, and they're angles, and they all have very distinctive meanings. So it's complicated. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was curious about the vermilion, because it seems to be present on a lot of those fibers in a way that's almost like it's not an accident.
Mm-hmm.
Like it looks like it might have been used for some kind of purpose, or?
Yes. So some belts were completely coated with vermilion. In some cases, all of the leather was coated with vermilion, or red ochre more commonly than vermilion. Yeah.
Do you have any speculation about why that might have been used?
Depends on the object. So for example,
Or maybe even part of the belt? Like the red line might mean something?
they can. So for instance, this is a belt that it's glass wampum. And by the way, I do categorize glass as a form of wampum. Many people categorize it as artificial or imitation or fake. But given that these are historic objects made by indigenous communities, I categorize it as still wampum in a different way. This belt came from the Blackfoot people. It was handed to, if I remember correctly, a bishop who carried it back, deposited it in Nicollet Seminary, which is a religious collection. And the scholars who had looked at it before I arrived said it's nothing. It's just black beads, glass wampum. It's probably just a strap for a bag or something. But when we looked at it with the light, what we saw is that these are not black beads, they're red beads. And the red is very visible when you hold it up to light. And if you hold it in front of a fire, which we didn't do, but we kind of wanted to do, it glows in this really unusual way. And so what would it mean for a group of Native people to hand this religious person a quote-unquote black belt that is glowing with red at its heart, and to say, take it away. We have nothing to do with you. Take this and go. That, to me, is a pretty clear message. But the museum tells us nothing of that. But the object tells us something different by the way it's colored. So I can speculate to a degree, and then there are cases where I can simply say, these are the questions. Consider this, and not go too far. I saw, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
You're very welcome.
One of the things you mentioned in response to a question is that there are probably about 500 belts
that exist.
How many different designs there are?
There's a fairly limited category of design motifs in the abstracts, but they are deployed in dramatically different ways. So with depth, I'll give you an example that's not here in the slides. There's a belt that I'm going back to visit at the Pitt Rivers Museum that is called a Jesuit belt because it was sent by the Jesuits to the Hurons and the Wyandot. And it contains in the middle a lozenge, which is similar in some ways to a dish symbol, but in this case a lozenge represents a fire, a council fire, around which people can gather. On one side of this council fire, there is a large cross. On the other side, there are two large crosses. So a simple answer is, 3 missions. But in re-examining this belt with Alan Corbière, we suddenly realized that those missions all have lozenges in them. So we're looking at a council fire that includes a mission, not just a mission. And that changes the way you think about those symbols independently and together. So that's why it's sort of a hard question to answer, because there is a language and there is a grouping of symbols that are used, but they're deployed in such dramatically different ways sometimes, and how they relate to each other changes as well. So it's not, so for instance, my student Lise Puyo is currently examining a wampum belt that lives at the Vatican that was made by the Algonquins, who are now at Kitigan-Zibi, and the Nipissing, and sent to the Pope. And Jolene, yeah, we were just talking about this last night. There were letters that were sent with it. And if you look at the belt, it shows a club, an axe, a figure with a bow, some arrows, some zigzags. Then in the middle it shows a native man and a religious person holding a cross together. Then on the other side it shows a church that's open. And then it has what looks like the word wampum in beads. And it's confusing because when you look at it, it looks like wampum is kind of upside down and backwards, and the symbols don't quite work, and it's a confusing looking belt, and it's long, it's a little more than 6 feet long. When Lise went to the Vatican to look at it in detail, she was able to realize that it was made up of multiple other belts. You could see where they had been pieced together. You could see where different alterations have been made. You could see where the divisions were between the figures, and you could see that what the symbol said wasn't the same as what the letters said. But the real distinction, the one that gives me chills, is that in the Algonquin letter, which was preserved in the original, remarkably enough, it's not that old, this is 1831, but the letter survived and French translation survived. The French translation said of this side of the belt, "Here I stand with my club and my axe and my bow and my arrows like a beast in the wilderness. But you have brought me the light of God, and I thank you and I send you this gift." That's what the French translation says. But once we got sitting down with Algonquin speakers, they're like, oh, no, 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 no. It says, "Here I stand with my club and my axe and my bow and my arrows among the creatures of the forest, and I hear your message and I reject it." And it's like, wow. Sending that message to the Pope is very different from sending a message of acquiescence. And the object corresponds with that language in a way that does not correspond with the French language. So that's also where we don't always have the luxury of having a written document that accompanies the wampum, but we at least have the material document. And that often needs more attention, more thought. Yeah?
I'd like to ask a question about some of the language that you used. So initially you mentioned wampum as a being and not an object.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about it throughout with some very interesting adjectives. You mentioned it flexes, it breathes, it twists, and that to put it in a container or to, where you could restrict its movement in a way, in essence. Mm-hmm. And I quite enjoyed the little anecdote about the post-World War I, where the objects actually sort of enabled movement.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if this idea of material as a being and not an object is something that you would extend in your work beyond wampum.
Mm-hmm. Very definitely. Not to every object. It's very much like that. There's a wonderful quote from Irving Hallowell working among the Anishinaabe and other peoples in the North, where he says, "Not all stones are alive, but some are." And so it takes an enormous amount of understanding and wisdom and insight, far beyond anything I could hope to have, to know which ones are alive and to what degree they're alive. And so I consider wampum belt a fairly unique category because it is so alive, whereas other objects are more nuanced. And this also circles back to that question on power and agency. And much of this is just my opinion here, much of the problems, many of the problems that exist today in dealing with issues like NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or dealing with issues of truth and reconciliation, have to do with these different understandings of what is meaningful and what is significant and what is sacred. So to a certain degree, terms like sacred and meaningful and significant have been co-opted by academia against indigenous peoples. And what indigenous communities have been saying continuously is that we know and we decide and we are aware of. And so often that's why I sometimes describe this work as search and rescue. I go into museums in search of beings that need attention. And sometimes I do not know until I'm there which beings those are. And as soon as I do know, you better believe I get in touch with people who really need to know. So, yeah, objects are alive. Yeah.
Hi. As you point to the reuse, repair, and alteration of the belts as seen in the work in the West, I'm wondering if you can see that in the beads themselves, and if so, how?
Great example. I'm not sure there's a good picture here that speaks to that, but where beads are very clean on the edges and don't show any signs of chips, they've been used either very lightly or this one time around. Where beads are broken, chipped, fragmented, there's a lot of reuse and rehandling. And then there are sometimes belts that are obvious that show signs of abuse. And we do know from some of the records and some of the oral traditions, there are moments when wampum is rejected. A very powerful message in the middle of an alliance is you receive a belt and you throw it to the ground. That's a way of rejecting that alliance. Or you break it apart. So some belts are taken apart and some are broken apart. And sometimes the traces of those activities are visible materially. And I believe to a certain degree they are also visible in the sense of recognizing that action. So, yeah. I have no idea what time it is. How are we doing for time? I'm good, so.
10 after 2.
Okay, please.
I'm just curious to hear your response to this. Years ago, I attended a conference in the Haudenosaunee territories, and there's an individual who makes replica belts, and he was instructing a group of teachers about them, and he said that by simply holding the belts, he could read the belts.
I would disagree. Yeah, I would disagree. And the reason I would disagree is because that kind of statement comes out of a perception that the figures are alphabetical or that they are so simply symbolic that you can just assign a meaning to one, or it comes out of memorizing what we've been told each of them means.
The way that he presented it was at a little deeper level, I would say, because what he did say was to say that the words come to him as he holds it.
That could be if you're in a community where you've heard those words often enough. But I'm not sure I entirely believe that. I don't disbelieve it, but a lot of it has to do with coherence. So for example, if you were to ask me that question 200 years ago, I would say unequivocally yes. And the reason is because 200 years ago, we can clearly state that in indigenous communities that handled wampum, there was continual showing and handling and speaking to such a degree that this became common knowledge. And that then in that system, it's almost like speaking a language. In that system, if you encounter a belt you've never seen before and hold it, you can recognize it. That's that sense memory, that sense recognition. But what has happened in between is so much confusion that I tend to be a little distrustful of someone who says they can immediately read something, because I don't know if they are truly picking something up from the object or reading into it. So that's when my skeptic comes out, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
I think among the Haudenosaunee people, we've lost a lot of people. There used to be people when I first was come over and see could read those beads on them. Now we got used to this, and we got chugging them up on all of the Great Law Peace and Cayuga, and now we've lost our own way. And we're trying to get it back at Tuscarora, but it's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah.
Just like the medicines. We have no people that know how to make medicines for our people. We have to go to the drugstore. That's what's happened to I say the whole Haudenosaunee. We're trying to get it back. We're going around doing the Great Law of Peace. At Gayogohó, I go to Gayogohó in the fall. But I mean, in my lifetime, I probably won't know everything that I've lost. So, I mean, it's good to have people like you who have an interest in our way of life.
Thank you. And I think these are two answers to the same question when you think about it, is that if objects are brought back into regular communication with the community, if people regularly recite in the oral tradition, if people regularly practice that, it can become alive again. I don't see these traditions as dead. I see them as sometimes as sleeping, like they're waiting to be reawakened. Thank you.
I don't think we'll lose it, but the younger generation don't really want to take the interest in what was given to us by the Creator.
Yeah.
And that was a different way of life than the Christian religion and whatever other religion. I respect everybody has their religion, but we had our own too.
Yeah.
I was just wanting to know if you ever heard of or know the name of the belt that was returned to the Tonawanda Senecas, and it's the belt that the Confederacy declares war. And we've seen it in Tonawanda, and we're all told to touch it. And it said when they declare war, the Confederacy declares war, they put a red covering on it. And there's still beads that show the red on it.
I have not seen that one. It was.
Know the name of it?
I don't. It was not brought out at the recital that I attended, and it's one of the list of ones I need to go back to at some point, but yeah, I'm sorry that I'm not familiar with it.
I think it was just returned to the Tonawanda Senecas like less than 10 years ago.
I think they only bring certain belts out at certain times of the year. It has to be done very carefully and ceremonially. So I think that might be a belt that you might not see if you're not there the right year or in the right time period or season even.
Yeah.
The Tuscaroras lost their belt. Was one when they got back they came into the Confederacy. Whenever they needed it, they borrowed that one that the Onondagas had. George Hamill said he seen it at the State Museum. He knew it was there, but then it disappeared.
Yeah, because I went.
What they do is they loan them out to a foundation, but then that's where they lay.
And I went looking for that one early on when I went to the New York State Museum, and it's not there.
I know.
So it's somewhere. Yeah.
Under the bed.
There you go.
He thought maybe it ended up with a rock foundation. And I asked Jamie when he was working, see if you can find our belt there.
Yeah.
He says, I can't find it.
Yeah, it's got to be somewhere. Well, it's like these two that surfaced at Sotheby's. They'd been hiding for 60 years. And then suddenly there they are at auction. So this happens. Jolene, I want to give you the last word. Anything?
Just like at home.
Or last question if you want. It could be a last question, whatever you want.
I would like you to bring up when Clinton Rickert went up and got the belts back. There was one belt that they said they didn't have a name for it, but I know what the name of it is. It's called the Hudson Bay belt. And those,
It's right there.
yeah, it's the one on the, right there. That's the Hudson Bay belt. That's what I was told.
Yeah.
And, there's a book called The Fighting Tuscarora. In that book, she describes that.
Yep.
She describes that belt. And we were up in Jimmy Bissell and myself, and we're up at Percy White Duck. I don't know if you've ever met him, but it was at his house, and he brought out some wampum, but it was made from quill. And first time I ever seen or even heard. And, but anyways, he was looking for them belts because these are the belts that they fought. I think it was 1924. For the freedom to cross that bridge. Well, anyways, or 25 says there. But anyways, I says I had heard that William Commanda had the belts And I mentioned it, and somebody kicked me under the table, you know?
Oh, yeah.
I never ever did find out who kicked me, but anyways, I shut up. I didn't want to say that we were speaking out of turn or what, but I know Clint, he used those belts to cross that bridge, and we still do it.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, exactly. That was a powerful moment in time.
What was that in Anishinaabe? So Algonquin, when you say Algonquin, you mean like Ojibwe or Huron or?
Algonquin is cultural and linguistic, and depending on who you're talking to, different terms are being used. So often the Kitiganzibi Anishinaabe are called Algonquin. The language they speak is Algonquian, but they also describe their language as Algonquin. And in New England, we often pronounce it as Algonquian with a K rather than a Q.
Their name for themselves.
So their name for themselves is Anishinaabe. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, these names are confusing. So yeah, those belts still exist. I can tell you they exist. I can tell you I have been close to them but have not seen them. And I can tell you that when they come out, it will be at the consensus decision of the Kitiganzibi Anishinaabe. And they're not there yet, so yeah.
There was a program on television the other day. The kids who were there, listening to it.
It's okay.
It hurt so well. You know, the trees, you know, we have lived up to our treaties. The United States government has broken almost every treaty that was ever made. And how do you awaken them? How do we awaken them? International law.
Yeah, yeah.
I've got what they call dry eye, but they should have called it wet eye.
Julian?
Well, this is a really powerful, body of knowledge you brought to us and shared with us, Marge, and we just really appreciate it. And everyone's here because they're interested in some way in understanding this, and so I appreciate everybody coming this afternoon and making the time to come here because, it's kind of hard to see the photograph of my grandfather, like Jay, Uncle Jay, because the alliance of indigenous peoples across the northern border is something that I think is reawakening, and I think that your research has really helped me to understand how not only does the study of the wampum bring to us a knowledge of its materiality, but it's also really part of, I think, this reawakening of these different alliances of indigenous peoples around the Great Lakes. And I wonder, I think about it's happening for a reason. And, we have to think, I think, and I put it to the young people in the room, that, each generation carries something, right? And so the wampum is reawakening, and we have to think about what that means.
He was watching the movie on the Kinzua Dam and how they destroyed.
Oh, yeah.
And they destroyed the
territory that they had lived for thousands of years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's part of it. I think that, we're constantly under threat of erasure or removal, and that our ancestors did have a way of defining space, and that's what this is part of. So,
Yeah. And I think also to sort of address, what you're raising is right now, there are people who are working on that conversation with state and federal and international agencies. That's important work. That's work I don't feel skilled enough to do, but this is something that I've been called to do and I can do. And what I think is happening in this work is that these wampum beings are also calling us to attend to them. That this conversation, this travel is necessary because they were made to circulate and among us. They were made to be spoken with and to. So I have a great sense of hope that this work will reawaken these beings in a good way and will also bring us closer together. It will cross that border again. And this time it will be, instead of arguing over who owns what, it'll be over how can we all support each other. Yeah. It's why I think the dish with one spoon is coming back so powerfully. That people are thinking about what does that mean as a concept of how we live in an environment over long periods of time. So that's where I am filled with hope, even in the midst of this awareness of incredible loss and chaos and destruction. I see it all. And I sort of am looking for, where's a path I can walk that will maybe, get us to the other side of that bridge safely? And can I create a path that other people can safely follow? So, thank you.